Fulcherove Arash, welcome back everyone. BioFarm Conference 2022, it is the fourth day. We've had some very interesting discussions already with Mike Walsh, a lecturer in the new Masters in Organic Farming and Biological Farming in SETU. Next up, I guess there might be some crossover because we are going to hear from Dr. James Humphreys. James has been working on clover with Teagasc on low input systems for 20 years. So we're going to go to him now and hear what he has to say.
Thanks, Anna. So good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to go through is the work that we're doing and really to talk about the reason for the work that we're doing. And really, I've been working on clover even before I was in Salahhead, when I did my PhD in Johnstone Castle a long time ago. And a lot of the focus of our work is on the management of white clover. So people often ask us, why don't we look more at multi-species? But our focus has been on managing white clover, getting a really good understanding of how you manage it. Now we'll incorporate other species, but really our focus is on white clover. And we've also been doing environmental assessments of the systems that we're running. It's mainly dairy systems. You can see the picture of the farm there in the background with the dairy herd. Look at nitrogen carbon cycling, nitrate leaching. It's very important in the past when the nitrates directive was being implemented. More recent times we've been focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and ammonia emissions, and also soil carbon storage. And I'll mention all those things as I go through the presentation. I suppose the background to the work is we've seen growing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and this is from the EPA, and it shows last year's greenhouse gas emissions are up 3% from agriculture, mainly due to higher fertilizer use, nitrogen fertilizer in particular, and also growing dairy cow numbers. So this is a national challenge, and if we look at the emissions coming from agriculture, they represent around 37% of national emissions. At the present time, I can remember giving presentations maybe 10, 15 years ago where we'd be talking about maybe agriculture representing 30%. So there's two things happening. One is other sectors of the economy, the emissions from other sectors are falling. And at the same time, especially since the abolition of the milk quota, we see expansion in dairy production, more cow numbers, higher fertilizer use, and greater emissions as a consequence. So agriculture is in the spotlight. We have COP27 going on at the moment, and I think dairy production in particular is in the spotlight from that point of view. So if we look at how we might go about lowering emissions from dairy farms, we could talk about extensive dairy systems like organic systems, for example. That will give us lower emissions per hectare, but it also gives us a lower output per hectare, lower return on land. And if we look at it from a unit of product point of view, it'll give us higher emissions per unit of product. And where that becomes important is when we think about marketing our products. So if an owner, a company like Nestle, for example, want to produce a product with a low carbon footprint, obviously they're going to look for the milk with the lowest emissions per litre, as opposed to the national problem, which is emissions per hectare. So we have the idea of, say, maybe looking at low input systems or lower stock systems. We also have this idea of sustainable intensification and offsetting. And really that means looking at this problem from a regional or a national scale. And the idea here is where you have more intensive production, that frees up land for other uses, for offsetting purposes, say forestry, for example, energy generation, biogas, biomethane. So there's two approaches we could take, and probably in the future it's somewhere in between is going to be where the answer lies. As Mike said already, if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions profile from a dairy farm, we can see that a very large proportion comes from biogenic methane, around 52%. And if we divide that pie chart up into livestock-related emissions, we can see we have the methane. We also have the 11% coming from excreta. So roughly speaking, as Hannah said, around 2/3 of emissions coming from the livestock, mainly methane, also some nitrous oxide in there. If we look at the other side of it, we have a very large proportion, particularly on more intensive farms, coming from fertilizer nitrogen use. And I guess in terms of the systems that we're looking at in Salahead, we're really looking at lowering the emissions on the left-hand side of that pie chart rather than trying to cut numbers. Because ultimately we still need cows to produce milk, we need replacement animals to maintain our dairy herd. And of course we can lower emissions from the dairy herd by better EBI, better genetics, higher EBI cows, more lifetime production per cow, and also a lower replacement rate. So in terms of the objective of our work, we're trying to lower greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farms. And we also, in the process, want to see if we lower emissions, how does that impact on profitability, obviously, which is the key consideration from a farmer's point of view, but also say how does it impact on milk production, because we have a massive investment nationally in processing capacity that we have to make use of. The other approach that we've been taking, and we've been looking at this now for a number of years, is readily available technologies, off-the-shelf technologies, things that we can adopt today. There's a lot of talk about, say, using methane inhibitors and these other products that are still in the pipeline, they're still being developed, they're not available. The approach we took is, if we want to cut emissions, how can we do it today? Of course, we've been at this now really since around 2008. And the technologies we're talking about is using clovers, red and white clover, protected urea, low emission slurry spreading, and also high generic merit cows, as I said. If we can maximize the lifetime production per cow, have a lower replacement rate, both of those things will give us lower methane emissions. So these are three systems that we've been comparing. First two systems we've been running on the farm in Salahead for a long time, but really the data I'm going to talk about here is since 2007. So these are full systems, studies, with around 27 cows per system. So we have a high nitrogen system there, which is the blue one. Very high fertilizer nitrogen input, 270 kilos per hectare. Pretty standard approach to fertilizer use, using urea in the spring and then can from May onwards. Because we've high clover content, or high nitrogen use, we've low clover content, around 11% in the swards. Splash blade slurry application. And the herd EBI is the average there we had last year. It's changing over time, of course, but that's a typical, what we'll call the old Moore Park blueprint for pasture-based dairy production. The second system that we're looking at there is a combination of using nitrogen fertilizer with clover. And again, this is a system we've been running since around 2000, so we have a lot of data on it. Using 105 kilos of nitrogen, mainly put on in the spring. 2 or 3 rounds on the grazing ground and also for first cut silage. Since 2017, it's only been protected urea. And because we've lower fertilizer nitrogen input to that system, we have a higher clover content, 23% on average over the year. Trailing shoe slurry application. For the first couple of years, we ran that with higher EBI cows. Then since 2019, we use the same EBI as the other herd. And then finally, this zero nitrogen system, which we've been running since 2019. So we were running the two systems. If we look at the middle system there, we're getting around a 16% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We said, what else can we do? What else could we focus on? So we decided to cut out the nitrogen fertilizer entirely. So we have zero nitrogen system, zero fertilizer nitrogen system. 30% clover in the sward there, because when you take out the nitrogen, you get more clover coming into the system. Trailing shoe slurry application. And again, for the last 3 years, we were running this with our highest EBI cows, because we want to identify what impact that can have on our greenhouse gas emissions. And you can really only understand this study if you think about, say, putting in place all the best practices that we can implement to lower our emissions. This is the pasture production. With the high nitrogen system, we've higher 15.7 tons, very high pasture production. The slightly lower pasture production with the clover with fertilizer. And the really big surprise, and we've run that system again this year, is no difference really in pasture production where we're putting in nitrogen onto the clover swards or if we're not. And now we've 4 years data accumulated on that. And essentially what we're saying, you put in nitrogen, you lower fixation. Put in nitrogen fertilizer, you lower fixation. You take out the nitrogen fertilizer, all that happens is you increase fixation. You can grow the same tonnage. So that's the basis for the systems. We've run those systems now for 3 years, 19 to 21. The other two systems ran 2 years previous to that. We're running it again this year, 2022, but we modelled the data up to a 50 hectare farm, similar in size to the farm that we have in Solihull, based on the data that's there. Stocking rate is based on the herbage production. You can see the different stocking rates, different systems, and the average concentrate was the concentrates we fed on the farm on average over the 19 to 21. This shows our greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions on the different systems. Now the kind of national baseline that we're working off is 1.2. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about accounting for the full global emissions. People are different. Some people look at emissions from a national point of view. We're looking at the full global emissions. So it's 1.2. Even our control there is coming in very well. Our high nitrogen system at 0.88. It's a very efficient system. Going down to the clover with nitrogen down to 0.75. And then with the zero nitrogen system down to 0.69, which is very low by any standard, by any international standard. And again, if we talk about marketing our products, clearly we'd be well ahead of most countries at that. Not only are we getting a lower emissions per litre of milk, we're also getting it per tonne, per hectare. And you can see going from around 12.5 there down to 9.3. This was the main focus of the work on lowering emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a spin-off benefit in terms of lower ammonia emissions. And there are limits on ammonia emissions nationally, and there are reduction targets that we have to meet. And 99% of our ammonia emissions come from agriculture, national ammonia emissions come from agriculture. So adopting this system also gives us lower ammonia emissions. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions then relative to the high nitrogen system, the middle system, as I said already, gives us around a 16% reduction. The zero nitrogen fertilizer system is giving us a 25% reduction. So that then ties in with the national target of achieving a 25% reduction from agriculture by the end of the decade. That's something that we can do in practice. I suppose the really important thing is then when we look at the net margin, we've looked at the first two systems in the past. We published a data back in 2012 for 2000-2010 data set. Very similar result here in this particular study. Very little difference there in net margin between the first two systems. The big surprise, of course, is that we have a higher net margin with the zero nitrogen system. And that's really because we've been able to maintain productivity with lower inputs. Now, when I was talking about the greenhouse gas emissions there, people have different methodologies. We're taking a global approach. We didn't include sequestration in the soil in those figures as well, and I'll give the reasons for that later on. If we delve more into the net margin, these are the figures for the different systems, modelled up to 50 hectare farm. What you'll see is higher milk sales, obviously with the higher output system, with the high nitrogen system, high fertilized nitrogen system. When you compare the two clover systems, you see the impact of EBI coming in there in terms of milk sales, higher fat and protein yields per cow. If we look at our variable costs, like the figures that we're using here, the costs, the average costs on the farm that we have in Solihull between 19 and 21. So the high nitrogen fertilizer prices and the higher prices across the board that we're seeing in 2022 aren't included in this, just to bear that in mind. The difference in fertilizer nitrogen costs between the systems, the high nitrogen was around 15,000, going down to zero obviously, and that's largely then reflected in the variable costs. In terms of the fixed costs, we fully costed labour into this study at 27 hours per cow per year at €15 per hour. So if you wanted to compare these figures to, say, profit monitor figures, you'd have to take around 50,000 in labour costs. There's 50,000 in labour costs included across the 3 systems. So you can take them back out. But again, that's kind of small breakdown to show how we got down to those net margins. If we did the figures for this year, which we've done provisionally, but we still don't have the full figures for this year in terms of milk price and everything else, the zero nitrogen system is substantially more profitable. You're talking 50 to 60% more profitable, bearing in mind the very high nitrogen fertilizer cost that we're looking at this year. So the conclusions from that piece of work is that we can substantially lower emissions and get higher net margins using existing technologies. There's no new technologies involved. Most of the technology we're talking about here has been available for at least the last 10 years. If we talk about where the reductions were coming from, the main one was from using nitrogen fertilizer. We're replacing nitrogen fertilizer with biologically fixed nitrogen, so taking that nitrogen out of the system and relying on clover. And lower stocking rate also lowered emissions. It's not so obvious, but we went from 128 cows down to 123 because of the lower herbage production on the zero nitrogen system. And really, if we talk about the 2 big ones in terms of getting down to 25%, they're the main ones. We could talk about the protected urea, but really in this study it was redundant. I'm not saying that protected urea won't give you lower emissions, but if you take nitrogen fertilizer out of it entirely, the protected urea no longer has a role. And then the less doesn't really give that much reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, certainly lowers ammonia, and it can give us more efficient use of nitrogen in the slurry. So from that point of view, it contributes. And I suppose the big challenge now is to get adoption of these technologies on farms. And we're seeing a lot of interest, huge numbers of farmers passing through Sol Ahead this year in discussion groups. So there is a lot of interest in it. Of course, there's a big difference between interest and adoption. So I mentioned we didn't include sequestration in our carbon footprint figures, and that's because we've been looking at soil carbon at Sol Ahead over it's nearly 20 years now. We've continued on this data set, but you can see there between 2000 and 2018, and this is the soil carbon levels that we have in Sol Ahead, which are very high. Talk around 14% organic matter in the soil. It's a wet soil, shallow topsoil. And this is under permanent grassland. And initially we thought we were getting some level of, if you look at the first 5 bars there, some kind of improving situation. And when we look at it over longer term, we see that it's pretty flat, that we're not really sequestering a whole lot of additional carbon. Of course, it's a complicated question. Then we decided we were going to look at the impact of reseeding. And this is some reseeding we did in 2008 when we cultivated to reseed to surface disking, not ploughing. Topsoil is too shallow, but we see a big reduction in big loss of carbon, mainly is carbon dioxide. Most of the carbon was lost very rapidly. And if we were to put that into context, if we say we're losing around 10 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per hectare from the farm in Sol Ahead, just reseeding 10% of the farm would double our emissions. So that's something we're very concerned about. We've tracked these paddocks to see what happened in the intervening time, and you can see that we regained that carbon over time. So under the permanent grassland, we kind of reach a point where the soil doesn't accumulate any more carbon. When we reseed, we lose a lot of carbon, that's carbon dioxide, but we gain that back over a 10-year period or so. And what we think now is that the initial gains that we saw from 2000 to 2010 was down to the farm had been reseeded in 1995. So it was probably the tail end of that restoration process, we could say. Of course, we're repeating this study now again in 2018. And we had lower emissions in 2018 because, as you'll remember, it was a drought. But again, we're going to track that, and we're continually looking at this change in soil carbon. So what can we say about that? We have high concentrations of carbon in the soil in Sol Ahead. There hasn't been a lot of reseeding done on the farm over many years. We can get very high carbon losses during reseeding. That's something we have to be concerned about. But because the ground will sequester back the carbon, you get huge release. There's space available to capture back more carbon. We consider our reseeding to be carbon neutral within the 10-year time frame. And we gain back that carbon over a 10-year period. Then the question is what happens to nitrogen, because as we know that organic matter is made up of carbon. There's obviously carbon in it, but there's also hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen and sulfur. So if we lose carbon as carbon dioxide, we're losing carbon and oxygen. We're also losing nitrogen. And as I said, in the 2 studies we've done where we've looked at this in detail, we've lost between 18 and 30 tons of carbon. That translates into around 100 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's a huge amount of huge losses. We also lose huge amounts of nitrogen as the organic matter breaks down. You're talking about between a ton and a ton and a half of nitrogen being released. And when we look at the carbon emissions, the carbon dioxide emissions, we actually have to be in the field measuring it as the field is being cultivated, because that carbon dioxide, it's lost very, very rapidly. And likewise with the nitrogen. Big release of ammonium into the soil. Of course, ammonium is held reasonably well in the soil, but ammonium doesn't accumulate, it doesn't stay in the soil, it's rapidly nitrified to nitrate. And that's then, of course, when the problems start. In a free draining soil, we can get leaching. We don't really get it in solid head because it's not a free draining soil. What's more likely to happen in solid head is we get denitrification, where the nitrate is broken down and released as a gas into the atmosphere, either as nitrogen gas or as nitrous oxide. So we've been measuring the leaching and the gaseous losses, and our conclusion is mostly going off as nitrogen gas. I suppose the problem with this is you release an awful lot of nitrogen at a time when there's no, the ground is bare after reseeding. You're waiting for the new crop to establish. So there's a lot of nitrogen there, but there's nothing to take it up in the first 6 weeks when a lot of the losses can take place. So it's very inefficient from that point of view. The second thing that we find is that fixation really kicks off after 5 or 6 weeks. We'll see the nodules fully developed, and you can see pictures here of the seedlings, 6-week-old seedlings of white clover on the left and red clover on the right. And we find that the red clover in particular has substantial capacity to fix nitrogen in the year. So if we put in a reseed in April, we'd fix substantial amounts of nitrogen in the soil after reseeding. So there's huge amounts of nitrogen in the soil after reseeding. And what we kind of say to farmers, if they want to really, the biggest challenge for farmers is to stop applying nitrogen. We have a very high reliance on nitrogen, particularly on dairy farms, on nitrogen fertilizer. The big challenge is to stop, to let the clover do the work. And really the best way to do that is with a new reseed 10% of the farm, stop with nitrogen on that 10%, and that's a really good way to get confidence in the system. So if we talk about nitrogen after reseeding, because it is a question that comes up, there is very large amounts of nitrogen available in the soil. It can be used fairly inefficiently, but there's still a lot of it there to be used. And also then we have nitrogen fixation kicking in after about 6 weeks. So there's plenty of nitrogen. And really, if you want to get the system up and running, you really have to allow the clover to develop. The worst thing you can do is, as Mike was saying already, on clover swards is to put nitrogen fertilizer on them, particularly in the after establishment. You reduce the capacity of the clover to fix nitrogen. If you give the clover nitrogen, obviously it's not going to fix it. These are kind of the seed mixtures that we use, and it's only an example. 8 kilos of perennial ryegrass, and the reason I put up Aston Energy there is a variety with a very high utilization index. Cows will graze it very tightly. We did a study a few years ago, it's almost 20 years ago now, where over the course of 3 years we grazed swards to 6 centimeters, 5 centimeters, and 4 centimetres over the course of 3 years. With dairy cows, 24 cows per system. And we found that by grazing to 4 centimetres, we increased production by 15% with no increase in inputs. So there's a very clear message there with clover swards. The tighter you can graze it, white clover swards, the more productive it will be. We normally put in 2 kilos of white clover, normally a mix of varieties. What we've been doing now for the last 5 years is putting in 2 kilos of red clover as well. When I was in college 35 years ago, we were told that red clover doesn't persist under grazing. We've red clover in sward now, 5 years old, and it's persisting very well and making a valuable contribution. So we see it as a real positive in the mix. So that's just an example of a mix. The reason I mentioned Milvis there is that that's the variety we used 5 years ago, and it's holding up very well. Now people would say 4 kilos of legumes in the mix is an awful lot. You have to bear in mind that 2 kilos of white clover, the seed of white clover is much smaller, as you can see there in the picture, so that's 3 million seeds, whereas 2 kilos of red clover is only 1 million seeds. You're talking about a ratio there of white to red clover of 3 to 1, just to bear that in mind. In terms of the white clover varieties, this is the list from 2022, and you see Bar Blanca there, large leaf variety at the top of the list, highest yielding variety, and that's why I picked it as an example. And then you can see Cool Fin there as a small leaf variety, again the second highest yielding variety on the list. But really I have no real strong preference for any white clover variety. Over the years I think we've used all of them. Have to be a lot more careful when it comes to red clover varieties. We don't have a recommended list in Ireland at the moment. Mainly use the UK recommended list. We've used some of these varieties, as I said, but these would be the ones I'd be happy to recommend. And Ferga there in the middle is a chaga spread variety, still not commercially available. There should be seed available maybe the end of next year or 2024. I'll just say there, this year with the red clover scheme, there's been a lot of red clover seed sold that's not on any recommended list in the UK, on the Scottish list, or even worked on the Northern Ireland. So you have to be careful of what's available and how suitable some of the varieties that are being sold, how suitable they are for our purposes. So then we get the sward established. As I said, we can get high levels of fixation. If we graze it tight, we can get high levels of productivity. So as I said already, we get high levels of fixation in the year of establishment. The full first year of production, we can get very high levels of production, particularly from red clover swards. And there's a close enough relationship between clover yield and fixation. So the challenge all the time is to maximize our yield of clover. And like when we talk about managing grass and clover, really you're trying to maintain a good balance between both parts of the sward over time. Because the real problem with clover is this idea of a clover crash, and people will talk about this idea. And basically the idea is if you start on the top there where you have nitrogen fixation taking place, you can fix a lot of nitrogen if you manage your sward well. That increases nitrogen availability in the sward. That pushes up pasture production, obviously. But the more nitrogen that's in the sward, the more that will favour your grass production at the expense of clover. So to some extent, the clover is its own worst enemy. Over time, maybe over the first 4, 5, 6 years, you'll get increasing productivity as there's more nitrogen being fixed in the soil. The grass is becoming more and more productive, the grass component of the sward. So sometimes even your most productive years is when you have relatively less clover in the sward because it's fixed so much nitrogen, it's favouring the grass. And of course, if you let that get out of control, next thing you get this crash in production because the grass eventually drives out the clover and you don't have clover there to fix the nitrogen. Our solution to that really is to monitor the situation and take off a crop of silage, because if we take off a crop of first cut silage, 5 or 6 tons of dry matter per hectare, that's taking around 150 to 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare out of the ground. And so by doing that, you put the balance back in favour of the clover. So in Salahead, on the grazing platform, as we call it, we'll try to cut silage off nearly all of the paddocks, at least 90% of the paddocks, every year for this purpose, just to keep mining nitrogen out of the soil. You take that nitrogen in, goes into the silage pit. Silage is fed to cows obviously during the winter, but you've taken that nitrogen out of the system temporarily. So what we think is, in terms of maintaining clover contents, mixed grazing and silage harvesting is very beneficial. That isn't always possible, of course, particularly on fragmented farms. And on outblocks and fragmented farms, what we'd be recommending is using red clover for silage, but don't really have time to go into that today. So we're mainly focusing on white clover today. So mixed grazing and harvesting will improve white clover content because you're redressing the balance. That will keep fixation going well, driving on the system, and also the persistency of clover in the sward. So other aspects of developing a highly productive clover swards, you need a good distribution of clover. And what can happen when the grass becomes very dominant is that the clover can become patchy. You see this patchy distribution of clover in the sward. Maintaining high soil P and K is important. Soil pH is very important because fixation is a biological process, so you need to have your pH close to 7 as possible. Normally for grassland we'd recommend 6.2, 6.5. In solid head we're trying to get all our soils above pH 6.5. Tight grazing, as I said, very important. Grazing out to 4 centimetres. And the work we're doing right at this moment for the last couple of years is looking at low covers over the winter, which we think has a really big impact on clover productivity. And also then there's a question about how much reseeding do you incorporate into the system. That can depend an awful lot on your stocking rate. On lower stock farms there's probably less need for reseeding. On higher stock systems like we're running at Solihead, within this idea of sustainable intensification, we're reseeding on a 10-year basis. The alternative to reseeding is oversowing, and that's where you just introduce clover seed into an existing sward. The method we use is on the left-hand side there with a fertilizer spinner. Other farmers use, say, a drill, like you can see there, with a seed distributor on top of a drill, on top of a tine harrow to introduce the seed. Either way, what you're looking for is an open sward. So in Solihead, where it's relatively wetter, it's a wet farm, we normally do it after first cut silage. On a drier farm, you'd need to do it earlier in the year. But you need an open sward where the seed can come in contact with the soil. You can see the seedlings coming through then in the second picture. And the really important point at that point is to keep the swards grazed out, to allow plenty of light down to the base of the sward. So we talk about open swards, we need moist soil conditions, and this year, for example, we didn't do any oversowing in May this year because we had very dry conditions. We normally put on 2 kilos of white clover seed per acre. We don't oversow with red clover, only with white clover. And as I said, you need to have a low post-grazing height for the first maybe 3, 4, 5 rotations. And that's something that takes, you need to pay attention to that. If the seedlings get overgrown at all, if you look at the second picture there, they're going to be killed. And once they're dead, that's it. There's no more coming back from that. But oversowing can work well. As I said, the real key to success is how you manage it after putting on the seed. So not allowing covers to get high. And when I say 800 kilos, this is only for oversown swards. I'm not talking about reseeds or like other swards in the farm. We'll manage them as normal with a pre-grazing cover around 1400. But it does, going into those low covers does mean short-circuiting your rotation. So if you're on, say, a 21-day rotation on the farm, 18, 21-day rotation, you might have to be going back into those paddocks on a 14-day rotation, which takes a certain amount of management. And also this idea of grazing it out well before the winter, allowing plenty of light down to the base of the sward to suit the clover. But there is a high risk of failure with this. And a lot of farmers that have tried it hasn't worked out for them, so you have to be careful. You really want to be, attention to detail is important, like it is in a lot of things in life. You can also have things that you can plan for, like a late frost. If you oversow in April, for example, you got a late frost that can kill the seedlings, or like what we've seen there for the last few summers now, where we get drought conditions. And the role we see for oversowing in solid is really for maintaining clover in an existing clover sward rather than trying to get clover into a non-clover sward. I think you're far better off to reseed. If you've no clover in the sward, you're far better off to reseed. So in solid, we reseed every 10 years. In the past, because of the whole risks around losing carbon during reseeding, so with less intensive systems, say an organic system for example, we'd probably be looking at reseeding much less frequently, maybe one year in 20, and using oversowing to a greater extent to maintain our clover in the second scenario. The low winter covers question, I don't know if you can see in the middle picture there on the right hand side, you can see this white clover stolon. We could lose maybe around half of our stolon over the winter, so we accumulate stolon during so if you think about the way white clover grows, if you ever see ivy growing up a wall, white clover grows in the same way. It grows along the surface of the ground through these stolons, very much like ivy. The amount of stolon that we have at the base of the sward will double over the course. Between March and September, we'll double the amount of stolon, and then during the winter, we lose half of that. And I think with inappropriate management, say when we were less experienced in the past, you could lose maybe 80% of your stolon over the winter, and that really puts you in a bad position in the following spring in terms of having good enough clover contents. So the work we're doing at the moment is looking at low winter covers, grazing out swards well before the winter. Very difficult under the current conditions with very wet conditions we've seen in recent weeks. But what we found is that by grazing out tight before the winter, over the winter, leaving low covers, plenty of light down to the base of the sward, we get much higher clover counts the following spring. We get higher fixation as a consequence of that, maybe up to 35% more fixation. So we're going to have a more productive system. And the other things that we found that by grazing tight over the winter, when we actually go out to graze those swards in the spring, we're not as tight for grass as we thought would be. We actually found those swards a lot easier to manage because you're working off a lower base. You can graze out those swards better. And it's just something to bear in mind. So just to finish up then, people often say to me managing clover sward is very complicated. I guess anything that's new seems complicated, but if we look at, say, grassland management, say 20 years ago when I was starting, say, in Salahead compared to today, you know, there's been massive improvements nationally in terms of how we manage grass. I think managing clover is just another step in that progression in improved management. And I think a lot of the success of what we've been doing in Salahead is improving management. And we can lower emissions then as a consequence of that. If we maximize our clover production, and that's the key, we can maximize fixation. The more we fix, the less need we have for fertilizer nitrogen. And if people said to us, you know, with a very high price of fertilizer nitrogen we've seen in this year, there could be a problem with the nitrogen availability next spring. I'd happily run the farm in Salahead, myself, the farm manager, we'd talk about this. We could easily run the farm with no fertilizer nitrogen, maintain the level of productivity that we are operating at. And of course, if you're not spending a lot of money, the savings we made in nitrogen fertilizer in Salahead last year, or this year for example, is around 35,000. So you talk about a more profitable system, and as I showed already, lower environmental footprint, need your soil fertility to be right, particularly soil pH. We see Ks also being very important, grazing out the swards to lower residuals over the winter, skinning out. Also choice of variety to fit in with that, grass variety, pick a variety that's easy to graze out to a low residual. And you have a star system now in the pasture profit index. You can select varieties within that. Aston Energy is just one I picked out because that's a variety that farmers are using and are very happy with. We normally build up covers in Salahead up to 1,200. I didn't say much about that in the presentation, but again, it's tied in this idea of maximizing the amount of stolon we've built up at the base of the sward going into the winter. And bloat is a problem then that needs to be managed. So, thank you.
You want to come back and join us? We will take questions from the audience and we will take questions from online as well. Thank you very much for that. I guess I have a couple of questions of my own, just to kind of clarify a few things. I guess you and Mike from earlier both agree that no nitrogen is needed after a reseed or after oversowing. But I remember being at a farm walk recently talking about clover, and they said that you definitely do need it. So there's some mixed messages there. But what would you use after reseed? Would you go in with watery slurry? What would you go in with?
So there is mixed messages around nitrogen fertilization, but I think for reseeds it's pretty clear cut that there is no requirement, or a very low requirement, you know, and if farmers want to get confidence, and I've done it with a group of farmers, just to challenge, just to see, and I'd say to any farmer, just try it, put in a reseed, assuming that you get good establishment to clover, there should be no need for nitrogen fertilizer, and just see how you get on with that.
I guess as well, just you talk there about challenges, but your research essentially proves that you can keep the productivity up and you can cut your nitrogen fertilizer completely.
So like we've a lot of data on that, and not only in Solihull but other places, but like we've been running the second system I talked about there with only nitrogen in the spring for 20 years, so we've a lot of data on that. We're confident about that, and we have, you know,
but
we can maintain. It's you have to bear in mind it's profitability rather than productivity. Okay. So we get some losses in productivity, but because you've lower costs, you lower cost of nitrogen.
That productivity versus profitability is your bigger challenge, or is the biggest challenge farmer mindset, or is it the challenges of establishing challenging clover on farms? Is it the farmer, or is it physically establishing clover?
Historically, I think I think when you put in the reseed, establish a good clover sward, that can work. That's the first step really for farmers. Second step then is to get the confidence not to apply nitrogen fertilizer, and the best thing to do is put in a reseed, good clover content, a lot of fixation taking place, and then take that forward. The biggest problems we've seen with reseeds out on farms, one is on commercial farms, the post-emergence herbicide often isn't clover safe, so they wipe out the clover in the first step. Or the second thing is put on nitrogen fertilizer, and as I said, the more nitrogen you put on, the less. It's like anything, if the clover can get the nitrogen for free, it won't fix any nitrogen. And really you need to carry that forward. You establish the clover, carry it through the first year, get the confidence, go on then for the second year.
Yeah. Sean, do you have any points that you want to come on there?
Yeah, in your presentation, you said that we'll say low output system like an organic thing, but if nitrogen was the artificial nitrogen is no longer the limiting factor, is there any reason why an organic dairy system couldn't achieve the similar targets as you're achieving, or is there other things we're not thinking of in that context?
Well, I think for the first thing, there is a limit on stocking rate on organic farms, around 2 cows per hectare. So that's one element. I think the other thing is we're using more P and K fertilizer than would be allowed in an organic situation.
So could you replace that P and K, like with nitrogen? The clover's done the nitrogen bit with slurry, or would it be sufficient?
To some extent, but I think I wouldn't be an expert now. Joe would be better than me on that, but I think you're allowed to go to index 2 for P and K. Like we'd be pushing index 3.
Okay.
Lime use could be the same. I think it could be very interesting. But I would say I would have no difficulty saying we could run an organic system with 2 cows per hectare. But that's the limit, so why would you go above it?
Okay, and I have one more question. I wanted to ask one thing. It didn't come up earlier in the presentation, but you made the comparison of the time management there. Do you see a comparison, and I think you said 50,000 of a labour unit across the 3 systems, but was there more or less or the same labour requirement in the zero nitrogen in the clover system?
Well, look, we use the standard value, and you could say, okay, with the clover, there are things you might have to do additional, say managing blood oil, for example, which we use very little of. managing. You need to be careful of our own bloat and moving cows, and there may be additional labour needed there to some extent. On the other hand, you're not applying any nitrogen fertiliser, so there's labour savings on both sides. To say one over the other, I couldn't say for sure.
Thanks.
I think the gentleman in the red jumper had a question, but I'll quickly come to an online question. James, how confident are you that the model is accurate to a true farm scenario if it was measured in situ?
So we've done a fair amount of measurements as well to supplement the modelling. So we have emission factors for the farms. We haven't measured methane, say from the cows directly. That's something we haven't done, but it's been done in Moore Park. Similar type of cows. We're using the same emission factors. You know what I mean? We can't measure everything in solid head, but we have, like in terms of the nitrogen aspect of it, we've done a huge amount of measurement. And I'd say there's even internationally, there's very few farms that would have the same depth of data that we have.
And would it all be online if people want to look for it later?
It's all published, yeah.
Sir, your question?
The previous speaker mentioned that emissions, if you like, is from dairy cows is a misnomer, because over 12 years the emissions, the methane is converted back to carbon dioxide. So that's an observation, and maybe it's been overplayed and overhyped a lot. And I mentioned, I had intended to say to the previous speaker that if he could pass on that information to the AFA, you know, to kind of counteract the misinformation about methane and reducing cow numbers. We made a mistake in the beef industry a number of years ago.
I don't know if we want to get into the beef industry.
Okay,
I think is the question there. Okay.
And they also made the same mistake in Denmark about mink. But anyway, my question is, first of all, red clover is not meant to be grazed, is my understanding, because you damage the growing point. Just your observations on that. And the second thing is dairy sludge on clover sward or on any sward. Any information on that, please?
Yeah, so obviously the dairy sludge, it's a useful source of nutrients on organic farms. And again, if you're Index 1 or Index 2, you have an allowance to import in dairy sludge, but then again, Joe talked better about that than I would. It's obviously an important, a useful source of nutrients. The red clover, exactly as you say, the big concern is that we damage the growing points with grazing. But we didn't do it for years. I'll put it to you that way. We've been doing it now for the last 5 years, and the red clover is holding up an awful lot better than we expected. And I'd be very happy to recommend to anybody to put red clover into a grazing mix. Because even if it doesn't last, even if it only lasts 4 or 5 years, in our case now we've 5 years done and we're very happy with it. I think there might be some work needs to be done around varietal choice, but you know, if we got that out of it, if it's giving us that additional benefit for the first 5 years of a sward, we'd be very happy with that. Even to the extent where we might even increase the amount of red clover we're putting into the mix.
Final question, and we'll take it from online. And it's an interesting one, I guess, in regards to perhaps loss of carbon. So regarding the chart on soil carbon and the photos which followed, was the soil ploughed before reseeding? It looks like the seeding itself was via injection, but there was no cover in the photo. Might sowing into cover have reduced the loss of carbon?
So, okay, so we're looking at two different aspects in soil ahead. One is where we cultivate, so we burn it off with Roundup. And then we surface cultivate, we don't plough because of the problem with, we don't really have the depth of soil in soil ahead, we'd actually start ploughing up subsoil. And in that case we lose a lot of carbon, but, and there is no cover for the first 5 or 6 weeks as the crop establishes. When there's a lot of nitrogen available, a lot of nitrogen gets lost. The alternative that we've been using, and we've been using that a lot more in the past, was oversowing. So we don't cultivate, get no carbon losses in that case.
And I guess what you said, we were quite emphatic on oversowing is fine with white clover, red clover. You'd suggest full reseed.
We've tried oversowing red clover twice.
Okay.
hasn't really worked out for us. We've oversowed with red and white clover and ended up with nice white clover swards with some red clover there. I've seen it out in farms as well. You see, what you have to bear in mind is, if we look at the growing point, if we look at how red clover grows, it's very much like a dock. So you have a deep taproot, number of growing points coming off that taproot. It has no capacity to spread.
Yeah.
So if you get a poor initial take with red clover, that's it. You're not going to get a bigger population over time. If you take, say, white clover, even if you get a poor strike, it has enormous capacity to spread through stolon production. And even if you got a poor strike, as I said, that can infiltrate the ryegrass with reduced competition by not putting on nitrogen fertilizer, obviously, and graze it tight to allow plenty of light to allow that expansion to take place. But even with a poor strike, you can still get a good clover sward maybe after a year or so.
Yeah. James, thank you very much for that.
One more question,
Ned
sorry.
O'Brien has a question. He's a speaker who's going to be speaking later.
It's,
Ned, what
no,
do
it's Kevin Brady is the
Kevin
name.
Brady, sorry, Kevin.
Just noticed when you were talking about the different cows, the EBI, on the no nitrogen group, you had the EBI was 195. Would that have an impact on your results? That's number one. Number two, you talked about the index and putting on P's and K's. Is it a case that you're not really looking at the biology and what's happening with the biology? Because the index is an indication of the availability of what's actually in the soil. It's been released. So are you looking at that, or are you just looking at the clover in isolation?
I think when you look at the, take the second question first, like we're not into the look at the soil biology really. It's very complicated. So we're looking at standard fertilization practices. If we look at root volumes, like we often talk about red clover, which is very deep rooted, and we could see evidence of that this year in the drought conditions. But like white clover in particular is very shallow rooted, and if we look at root volumes, 80% of the root volume in the soil is ryegrass. Like ryegrass is ultra competitive for nutrients in the soil. We think the small regular applications of potassium in particular is important to help maintain the clover contents. So we're going regularly with potassium. In an organic situation, you probably wouldn't have the same leeway as we have, say, in a conventional type situation. The question about the EBI, yes, but that was part of what we were trying to do. We were trying to implement all the best practices to see how we could lower the emissions. I suppose to some extent, if the impact of EBI was measurable in terms of lowering carbon footprint, but it would be third on our list of the big things that gave us the reductions. The number one thing was taking nitrogen fertilizer out of it. That's the big one. The fact that we could run the system with less cows and still be more profitable was the second biggest element of that. The EBI didn't make a contribution, and we were able to pick that up over a 5-year period in terms of lower emissions and lower replacement rate, more milk per cow. You get what I'm driving at. So it was there, but I would say what my comment about EBI is that that's a slow burner, that we'll get improvements over time, but it's not going to give us massive improvements overnight.
Okay. James Humphreys, thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much.
And we'll be back in 2 minutes with Joe Kelleher, a specialist from Teagasc in organic dairy.